Hello and welcome to ED Extra, the new home for all of ED's special audio features, building on our long-running Sustainability Uncovered podcast with one-on-one interviews, site visits, analysis, panels and more. Hello and welcome along to ED Extra, the podcast channel that is home to discussions about sustainability leadership with sustainability leaders. I'm ED's content editor, Sarah George, and in this episode, we're looking at the climate-related risks which are already disrupting global supply chains and pushing up commodity prices. Insure Our Future estimates that insured losses from natural catastrophes surpassed $135 billion globally in 2024 for the first time. Flooding, droughts and other extreme weather has impacted supply chains as diverse as fruit and vegetables from southern Europe to semiconductors from China. So how can businesses respond proactively and plan ahead to boost their resiliency? To help me find out, I've invited on as our guest for this episode George Richards, who is the director of JRP Solutions, and he brings a wealth of experience in helping businesses big and small to deliver sustainable solutions that benefit their bottom line. So thank you so much for your time today, George. How are you?
All good, thank you, Sarah. Good to see you as always.
Yes, great to catch up. And while you and I are familiar with each other, would you mind introducing yourself for the listeners and letting them know a bit about your experience in supply chain sustainability?
Yeah, sure. So George Richards, director at JRP Solutions. I've been with JRP for 14 years. Prior to that, my background has been in energy and net zero and also innovation. So looking at things a little bit left field sometimes, which is certainly, I think, in the journey along net zero and helping organisations, sometimes the way you need to be looking at things in a non-traditional way.
Yeah, and what we're seeing in terms of what we're talking about today, so supply chain risk management definitely seems to be non-traditional, given what we've been seeing in recent years. But we are seeing that some sustainability managers, as you say, have been sort of in compliance mode or maybe in net zero mode and thinking about their operations. So where can businesses even start with the basics of understanding value chain climate risks?
Well, start at home. It's a little bit like looking at net zero. You start with scope 1, scope 2, get your own house in order first, and then start looking at your supply chain. And I think a lot of organisations that perhaps started that journey 5-6 years ago are now at the point where they are spending much more time focusing on their supply chains because they've got their own house in order. And I think in terms of climate resilience and the whole conversation, it's still in its embryonic stages for most organisations. Some large organisations with large global supply chains have begun to realise the impacts that climate change is already having on their own operations and their own supply chains. But I would say that for the large part, many organisations haven't even begun to think about it, and they need to start thinking about it.
Got it. And it does seem from what we see sometimes is that, like you and I, just as the consumer, you sometimes just see the blunt end of this where businesses have to act not proactively, but reactively. You know, they can't deliver their cars on time because a component is missing, or your chocolate bar is suddenly much more expensive because farmers of cocoa haven't been supported. So how can businesses become more proactive and spot those vulnerabilities before they disrupt their operations or their supply chains?
Sure, it's a little bit, I suppose, again, making the analogy or drawing the analogy with your net zero journey is you do a gap analysis. And in essence, what you're doing is looking at the risks that are specific to your own organisations, both from an operational site perspective and, of course, a supply chain perspective, and looking at the materiality and the immediacy of some of those risks to understand how great the risk is, how the likelihood of those risks and how quickly they're likely to manifest themselves, to understand the impacts of those. Then once you've done that, you can arrive at a number basically which is called the value at risk, if you like, because CFOs and CEOs and shareholders definitely want to know, well, okay, what is the cost likely to be? What's the cost of inaction and what's the cost of action to mitigate those risks. So you need to understand what the number is associated with that bundle of risks. And it will be different for every single organization in accordance with their operational locations and, of course, their supply chains. What's in their supply chains, what are they buying, where they're buying it from, and how critical those products or ingredients are to their core business activity.
Got it. And George, we often hear about how companies, as you say, the very big ones probably have quite a mature risk management function in-house, but a lot of the SMEs won't, and not everyone will have the skills. So should everyone be doing their gap analysis in-house, or is this a partnership opportunity?
Well, I mean, we would always encourage organisations to do as much for themselves as possible, but in recognising the limited resources available to to many organisations outside of the big corporates, as we fondly call them, sustainable departments of one, where they're spending an inordinate amount of time managing data and reporting requirements and very little time, in actual fact, being able to do much about it. Quite often, you're better off reaching out to a third party who can provide that expertise in that moment and give you greater insights into what the risks are for your own organisation, what the materiality of the risks are, what you can do about those risks to mitigate them.
Got it. And that's what I wanted to come on to. So you've done your gap analysis, you know where your vulnerabilities are. What happens next? What usually happens when a business then wants to intervene to adapt and to make their supply chains stronger and more resilient, or even their operations?
Yeah, well, as I say, similar approach to net zero. You get your own house in order. So you look at your own operational sites, if indeed that's where the greatest risk or the most immediate risks are. So I'll give you an example. A commercial laundry we worked with quite recently discovered that out of their 16 sites, 7 were at severe risk of flooding within the next 10 years. Now, when you look at that particular scenario on an operational side, it's not just, oh, okay, well, we can do something about drainage or we can build flood defences for that particular site. It goes beyond that, doesn't it? Because if the site's flooded, then the local infrastructure will be flooded. So your ability to get people in and out of work or goods in and out of your site is also going to be very limited. So it goes beyond that. So then you have to start thinking more strategically and thinking, okay, well, if we can't directly mitigate those risks to those particular operating sites, then we need to then consider, do we relocate the sites? Do we do something different? Do we buy another competitor business which has sites in better locations? Do we amalgamate sites? So all those things come into your strategic planning. But then as you think about your supply chain, which is way more complex and often much more extended, way beyond the UK, we're living in a global economy. Then you have to start looking at, well, what's the key? Let's take it if you're a food producer. What's the key ingredients? What are the things that we can't live without? Are there substitutes for those ingredients? Can we do some product development? Can we change our manufacturing processes? Do we look for alternative suppliers from regions that are less vulnerable? Or is there some way in which we can mitigate the risk by keeping greater stocks of certain things? If you go back to the sort of 80s where you had the just-in-time stocking system, people used to have warehouses full of spare parts and spare ingredients, etc., and the just-in-time stocking system was brought in to release that tied-up capital. Well, if you look at Jaguar Land Rover and how they operate, and most automotive companies, they have that just-in-time system where quite literally they'll be down to their last 2 or 3 component parts, and a delivery literally has arrived at the docking bay, gets unloaded straight in, and they carry on. So it's cutting it really fine. So if you even have something like a major accident on the local motorway network, that can cause real issues, let alone if you have a site, let's say, on the other side of the world that's producing a microchip, and that site gets flooded, which is what happened in Thailand a number of years ago, almost brought the entire global motor industry to a grinding halt because they were the only suppliers of that particular microchip. So it's understanding what your vulnerabilities are, how critical those vulnerabilities are, and then looking at how you can mitigate those particular risks. And the answers will be different for every single organization, because every single organization, even in the same sector, will have a different supply chain.
Got it. And it does sound that like this isn't necessarily for every business. It's sort of, a small piece of work. It sounds really long-term, strategic. You might have to change your core business models. You might have to change your core product offering. You might have to share data with other local organizations that you never have. Is that right? That this is a really strategic and long-term thing when it's done properly?
Absolutely, it's strategic. It's not tactical at all, because if you think about some of the decisions you're going to have to make, it really does impact the core business. It'll impact share value if you get it wrong as well, and it'll impact your ability to continue with your core business activities if you choose to ignore it. That's always a choice, of course. You can ignore the risks, but of course, it's not going to end well, is it?
Got it. And George, I'd like to come back to how this fits into sort of the rest of a corporate sustainability strategy a little bit more. So you've used lots of net zero analogies, and it does seem that corporate sustainability in the first instance seemed to be about compliance and sort of doing less bad, a little bit less emissions, a little bit less waste, etc. So how do you make adaptation and resilience fit in with an existing corporate sustainability strategy that's probably mainly centered around things like net zero or waste reduction?
Yeah, because as I said, we live in a global economy, and we're very much a connected global community. So no longer now can we isolate ourselves, and perhaps we never could, from things that go on the other side of the world. So if you have wildfires in Australia, or you have flooding in Thailand, or you have, the awful fires we've seen in America, which happen every single year, or flooding in Europe, like we had with Valencia 2 years ago, it has an effect on all of us, whether it affects, for instance, with the Valencia floods, that was all around 25% of the UK salads and citrus fruits come from that particular region. So it affects the supply. And when you get a shortage of supply of anything, the inevitable consequence is that prices go up. If you get the microchip analogy or example I gave you earlier, yes, it's happening on the other side of the world. And most people in the UK, for instance, wouldn't even know it happened. They wouldn't be aware that necessarily, because it's not necessarily reported here, but it will have an impact on businesses and consumers in the UK. So it's very, very much global. I think where we've been to up until now is very much about, and quite rightly, taking responsibility for our own impacts on the environment. However, the reality of it is the UK accounts for only circa 1%, let's say, for the sake of argument, of total global greenhouse gas emissions. You've got much bigger players, much bigger emitters in the world, which, we're all very familiar with: India, China, America, who aren't taking the actions necessary that we're taking, that aren't being as aggressive. So therefore, the impacts of climate change are inevitable, and they will be felt, even as we know, if everyone stopped emitting any greenhouse gas emissions today, the climate would carry on warming, and the resultant changes in extreme weather incidents and droughts and wildfires would continue for some decades to come. So we can't bury our heads in the sand. This is going to continue, and it's going to get, unfortunately, worse than we've experienced it to date. That's inevitable, because the global temperatures are continuing to rise. So we have to learn to live with it. So I think the focus now needs to change from, yes, we need to continue to minimize our own impacts, because that's a responsible thing to do anyway. That's what we should all be doing as individuals and as organizations. However, now we need to recognize the fact that we haven't been able to stop global warming to the extent that perhaps 10 years ago we thought we might be able to. And therefore, we have to recognize the consequences and the risks that come with those changes, and start taking action around that to protect ourselves, our own businesses, and our own infrastructure.
Got it. And George, I'm honestly could talk to you about this all day. It's really hard hitting stuff, and stuff that, as you're saying, affects every sector, every geography. But that's all the time we have for this particular episode on ED Extra. So thank you so much for your time and for your insights.
You're welcome.